There is a moment that separates the builders from the broken. Not a dramatic moment, not a cinematic one. It arrives quietly, usually on a Tuesday, usually when the room is empty and the phone is silent, and you realize with perfect, brutal clarity that everything you are waiting for is never going to come. The investment, the endorsement, the friend who finally gets it, the family member who stops asking when you are going to get a real job. None of it is coming. And the question that defines the rest of your life is what you do with that realization. Most people collapse. They interpret the silence as a verdict. They decide that the absence of support is evidence that they were never meant to build anything. They retreat. They shrink. They find someone to blame, and they hold on to that blame like a life raft because blame is easier than responsibility. They become the permanent victim of a story where everyone else is the villain and they are the hero who is simply never given a chance. And they will tell that story until they die. But there is another response. A rarer one. A colder one. It is the response of the person who reads the silence differently, who looks at the empty room and does not see abandonment, who sees space, who looks at the absence of a safety net and does not feel terror, who feels freedom. This is the Machiavellian response. And it is not for everyone. It was never meant to be. Niccolò Machiavelli spent years in exile, stripped of his position, stripped of his influence, locked out of the political world he had dedicated his life to. And in that exile, in that forced isolation, he wrote the single most important manual on power that the world has ever seen. He did not write it with a committee. He did not workshop it with supporters. He did not wait for a mentor to guide his hand. He sat alone in the dark, and he excavated the truth. The prince was born not from privilege, not from support, but from the specific kind of clarity that only isolation can produce. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. Look at the people who have actually changed the trajectory of civilization, and you will find, again and again, the same biographical detail buried somewhere in the early chapters. A period of profound aloneness. A stretch of time where the world either forgot them or actively worked against them, where they had no audience, no investors, no cheerleaders, no one texting to check in, just them and the work and the question of whether they had the constitution to keep going when every signal from the external world was telling them to stop. You are in that chapter right now. I need you to understand that. Not as a consolation, not as a way to make the pain feel meaningful, but as a strategic fact. The chapter you are in right now, the silent one, the hard one, the one where you feel invisible, this is not a detour from the path. This is the path. The people who skipped this chapter, who got early support, early validation, early momentum handed to them by circumstance or connection or luck, many of them never developed the specific internal architecture that this chapter builds. They got soft. They got dependent. They built empires on borrowed confidence, and the moment the support shifted, so did they. You are being forced to build something they never had to build, a foundation that belongs entirely to you, a set of capabilities that cannot be borrowed or transferred or taken away because no one gave them to you. You forged them yourself in a furnace that most people never survive. Machiavelli understood something about power that the comfortable have always struggled to grasp. He understood that the man who rises with help is always, at some level, in debt to the people who helped him. That debt is invisible in the good times. It becomes visible the moment interests diverge. The moment your vision conflicts with the vision of the people who backed you. Suddenly, you discover that the support was never unconditional, that the investment came with strings attached, that the cheerleader had a preferred outcome, and when your path stopped serving that outcome, the cheering stopped. This is not cynicism. This is history. Read it carefully. The supported leader who forgets where his support came from gets reminded, brutally. The king who depends on his nobles for military power discovers what that dependency really means the first time he makes a decision the nobles dislike. Machiavelli documented this with almost clinical detachment. He was not bitter about it. He was precise about it. He was telling you, centuries in advance, that the architecture of your power matters more than the speed of your rise. An empire built on your own capability is an empire that no one can dismantle from the inside. There is no inside access. There are no shareholders. There are no co-founders with leverage. There is no board that can vote you out. It is structurally indestructible in a way that the supported structure simply cannot be, because it has no external load-bearing walls. Everything holding it up is internal. Everything holding it up is you. And yes, that means everything depends on you. That is the trade. That is the weight of it. There are no days where you can coast on someone else's momentum. There are no weeks where you can check out because your partner is handling it. There are no safety valves. When it goes wrong, it is yours. When it stalls, it is yours. When the doubt comes, and it will come, there is no one sitting across from you to remind you why you started. You have to be that person for yourself. You have to develop that internal voice to a level of authority and clarity that most people never achieve because they never needed to. They always had someone else to outsource that function to. The ones who make it through develop a relationship with themselves that is almost frightening in its intensity. They know their own mind with surgical precision. They know exactly what they are building and exactly why. They have sat alone with the question long enough that the answer is no longer uncertain. It is not a hope or a wish or a vision board aspiration. It is a fact they carry in their chest like a compass. And that compass works in the dark. It works when the external world offers nothing but noise and resistance and silence. Now let's talk about the practical mechanics of building alone. Because inspiration without architecture is just noise. You can feel the fire. You can accept the isolation. You can reframe the loneliness as strategic advantage. But if you do not know how to actually operate inside that isolation, if you do not have a system for converting solitude into output, you will burn through your resolve in 3 weeks and end up back where you started, scrolling through someone else's highlight reel at midnight, wondering where you went wrong. The first thing you have to understand is that your mind, unsupervised, is your greatest enemy, not your competition, not the market, not the people who doubted you, your own mind. Because your mind was not designed for the kind of sustained, unvalidated effort that building alone requires. It was designed for survival in a social environment. It was wired over hundreds of thousands of years to seek approval, to monitor social standing, to conserve energy unless the tribe was watching. When the tribe is not watching, the mind starts generating reasons to stop. It manufactures doubt with extraordinary creativity. It reframes quitting as wisdom. It repackages retreat as self-care. It will construct an airtight philosophical argument for why the thing you are building is not actually that important and why you should probably rest today and start fresh on Monday. You have to know this is coming. You have to treat it not as truth, but as weather. It is not a signal from the universe that you should stop. It is a neurological event. It is your brain running its default programming in an environment that default programming was never designed for. The outlier is the person who can observe that programming running without being controlled by it, who can sit inside the doubt, acknowledge it, and keep working anyway. Not because they feel certain, not because the doubt has been resolved, but because they have decided that the doubt is not the deciding vote. Machiavelli wrote about the concept of vert, and most people translate this as virtue in the moral sense and miss the point entirely. Vert was not about being good. It was about being effective. It was about the capacity to impose your will on circumstances rather than being shaped by them. It was the quality of the person who, when fortune turns against them, does not accept the verdict, who pushes back, who finds the angle, who refuses to be a passive recipient of whatever the world decides to hand them. This is what you need to develop inside the isolation, not optimism, not positive thinking. Vert. The cold functional capacity to keep moving when everything in your environment is telling you to stop. The second mechanical principle is the management of your energy, not your time. Everyone talks about time management. Almost no one talks about energy management, and this is why most productivity advice eventually fails the person trying to build alone. Time is a fixed resource. You have the same hours as everyone else, but energy is a variable resource. It can be cultivated, protected, squandered, and strategically deployed. And when you are building alone, energy is the only currency that actually matters because you have no one else's energy to borrow from. This means you have to become ruthless about what you allow into your system. Every conversation that drains you without producing anything is a withdrawal from a limited account. Every hour spent consuming content that leaves you feeling inadequate is a withdrawal. Every social obligation you fulfill out of guilt rather than genuine desire is a withdrawal. Every time you open an application designed by billion-dollar companies specifically to hijack your attention and manufacture artificial anxiety about your social standing, that is a withdrawal. And the account has a bottom. When it hits zero, you do not just feel tired. You lose the capacity to access the internal state that building requires, the creative clarity, the strategic focus, the ability to sit with a hard problem long enough to actually solve it. The person building alone cannot afford a single unnecessary withdrawal. This is not antisocial. This is financial. You are managing a budget, and the budget is tight because you have no incoming transfers from a support network. Every unit of energy has to be earned internally and spent deliberately. This requires a level of self-knowledge that most people find uncomfortable because it means admitting, clearly and without apology, that certain people in your life cost more than they contribute, not because they are bad people, simply because the math does not work. And when you are building alone, the math has to work. The third principle is what Machiavelli would recognize as the strategic use of invisibility. There is a reason the most dangerous moves in chess are often the quiet ones, the piece that has been sitting in the corner for 15 moves that you stopped accounting for, the player who builds positions silently before the attack becomes obvious. Visibility is a liability when you are in the construction phase. Every time you announce what you are building, you invite interference. You invite the skepticism that leaks your energy. You invite the well-meaning advice that muddies your clarity. You invite the comparisons and the questions and the subtle social pressure to make your vision more conventional, more explainable, more comfortable for people who are not trying to build anything. Go underground. This is not about secrecy for its own sake. It is about protecting the fragile early architecture of something that has not yet developed structural integrity. Every great thing starts as a small, vulnerable idea. In its early form, it cannot survive sustained exposure to doubt. Not because the idea is weak, but because ideas at that stage are not yet hardened by execution. They are still malleable, still susceptible to being reshaped by external pressure into something safer and smaller and less threatening and therefore less powerful. The ghost phase is not permanent. It is not about hiding forever. It is about understanding that there is a time to build and a time to reveal, and that most people reveal before they have built anything worth revealing. Work in silence until the work speaks loudly enough to make silence impossible, until the results are so undeniable that the announcement is redundant, until you can walk into a room not asking for belief but presenting evidence. That is a fundamentally different posture than the person who is still trying to convince people to get on board. Convincing requires energy. Evidence requires nothing. Evidence simply exists, and people respond to it, or they don't, and either way, your position is unchanged. The fourth principle is the deliberate construction of an internal board of directors. You have no external support network. Fine. Build an internal one. Machiavelli did not have peers he could consult in exile, but he had absorbed centuries of political history so deeply that he could hold imaginary counsel with the greatest strategic minds who had ever lived. He could ask what Caesar would do, what Moses would do, what the great republics had done when faced with similar configurations of power and threat. He was never truly alone in his thinking, because he had populated his mind with a library of strategic precedents so extensive that he had access to more wisdom than most councils could provide. You have access to every book ever written by every person who built something alone. You have access to the documented thinking of every outlier who went through this exact valley and came out the other side. Read them not as inspiration, but as intelligence. Extract the operational details. How did they manage the doubt? How did they structure their days when there was no external accountability? How did they make decisions when there was no one to consult? How did they sustain the belief when the evidence had not yet materialized? This is not motivation. This is fieldcraft. You are learning the specific techniques of survival in the terrain you are operating in from the people who have already navigated it. Build that internal counsel deliberately. Know whose voice you are invoking when you need strategic clarity. Know whose example you are drawing on when the physical endurance is required. Know whose philosophy you are applying when the ethical complexity of ambition creates friction with the simpler demands of the life around you. This counsel does not need to be alive. It does not need to know you exist. It just needs to be real enough in your mind that you can genuinely access its perspective when you need it most. There is a stage that comes after the ghost phase and before the arrival, and almost no one talks about it honestly, because it is the least cinematic part of the journey. It has no montage. It has no dramatic turning point you can point to later and say that was the moment everything changed. It is just a long, featureless stretch of road where you are doing the work and nothing visible is happening, and the question of whether any of it is actually accumulating into something real has no answer yet. This is the stage where most people who survive the early doubt finally break. They made it through the initial resistance. They entered the silence. They stopped seeking validation. They built the discipline. And then they hit this stage, and the sheer length of it defeats them in a way that the early storms never could. Because the early storms had intensity. Intensity is survivable. You can meet intensity with defiance. You can grit your teeth against a violent opposition and find something heroic in the resistance. But this stage is not violent. It is just long. And long is a different kind of test entirely. Long tests the quality of your relationship with the work itself. Long asks whether you are doing this because of what it will produce or because of what it is. Long strips away every motivation that is contingent on outcome and asks what is left when the outcome is uncertain and the timeline is invisible, and the world around you has long since moved on to deciding that you are simply someone who never quite made it. Machiavelli sat in that stretch for years. Not months, years, writing letters to friends who had influence, trying to get back into political life, being ignored or dismissed or given polite responses that meant nothing, working on manuscripts that had no guaranteed audience, thinking thoughts that had no immediate application. And in that period, in that long featureless corridor, he did something that separated him from every other exiled political thinker of his era. He stopped trying to get back to where he was and started building something that had never existed before. He stopped looking backward at the position he had lost and started looking forward at the ideas that only his specific combination of experience and isolation and enforced reflection had made possible. The loss became the lens. The exile became the education. And what emerged from that period was not a desperate attempt to prove his worth to the people who had dismissed him. It was a body of work so far ahead of its time that it is still being argued about 5 centuries later. He did not succeed despite the isolation. He succeeded because of what the isolation demanded of him. It demanded that he go deeper than he would have gone if the external world had kept rewarding him with status and position and the comfortable validation of institutional belonging. This is what the long middle is for. Not endurance for its own sake. Not suffering as a prerequisite to deserve success. The long middle is the period of deepening. It is when the work stops being a performance of capability and starts being an actual excavation of it. When you stop working at the level that would impress an audience and start working at the level that the problem actually requires. When the craft stops being a vehicle for recognition and becomes the thing itself. This shift is only possible in isolation, and it is only possible over time, and it produces a quality of output that the person who has always had an audience, always had a deadline, always had an external standard to perform against, simply cannot match. You have to fall in love with the process in a way that is almost irrational. Not because the outcome does not matter, it does. But because the outcome is not available yet, and the process is all you have, and if you cannot find something in the process itself that sustains you independent of results, then you will not survive the length of the road. The people who make it through the long middle are not the ones who wanted the destination most desperately. They are the ones who found something in the daily act of building that fed them at a level deeper than reward, a kind of satisfaction that does not require external confirmation because it is generated entirely by the internal experience of doing the work well. Find that. Locate the specific part of what you are building that produces that internal signal, the moment in the work where time disappears, the specific problem that engages you so completely that the absence of an audience stops mattering. Build your days around protecting access to that state. Everything else is infrastructure. That state is the engine. Without it, you are running on willpower alone, and willpower is a depletable resource that eventually runs out no matter how strong your character is. The internal signal is renewable. It regenerates. It is the only fuel source that can sustain a journey of this length. Now I want to talk about what happens on the other side, because you need to see it clearly and you need to think about it carefully before you arrive. Because arrival has its own dangers, and the person who was not warned about them is often destroyed by the very success they spent years building toward. Machiavelli documented this pattern obsessively. The prince who fights his way to power and then loses it not to an external enemy but to the internal corruption that power produces. The leader who survived every external threat and then was undone by the comfort and the flattery and the gradual erosion of the qualities that made the rise possible in the first place. When the results start arriving, and they will, people will appear. People who were nowhere during the construction. People who have a remarkable ability to have always believed in you, despite the fact that you never once saw them during the years when belief would have actually meant something. They will come with warmth and with offers and with the particular energy of people who want proximity to momentum. And you will feel something complicated. A pull toward them, a genuine human desire to finally be embraced by the community that the long isolation made you hunger for. You are allowed to feel that. You are allowed to let people in. You are allowed to build relationships and alliances and even friendships in the season of results. But you must never forget the room when it was empty. Not as a grudge. Grudges are too expensive and too small for the person you have become, but as data, as the most reliable information you will ever have about who people actually are versus who they present themselves to be when the lights are on and the momentum is visible. The people who were there in the empty room, if there were any, even one, even someone who asked nothing and offered something small but real during the hard years, those people have demonstrated a quality of character that is genuinely rare. Treat them accordingly. Everyone else, treat well, treat fairly, treat with the generosity that your position now allows. But allocate your trust according to the evidence, and the evidence was collected during the years when there was nothing to gain from showing up. This is not bitterness. This is Machiavellian clarity applied to the post-success environment with the same precision you applied it to the pre-success one. The strategic principles do not change because the circumstances changed. The game does not stop being the game because you are winning it. If anything, the stakes increase because now you have something to lose and the people around you have real incentive to misrepresent their intentions. Protect the source. This is the final principle and the most important one. The source is the internal architecture you built during the isolation, the self-knowledge, the direct relationship with your own judgment, the capacity to sit in silence and hear your own thinking clearly without needing it filtered through someone else's approval. That architecture is your most valuable asset, and it is the most vulnerable one, because success creates noise, and noise is the enemy of the internal signal. Suddenly there are meetings and obligations and people whose feelings matter, and decisions that require consultation, and the quiet room where you built everything becomes harder and harder to access. Guard it ferociously. Build it into the structure of your days permanently, not as a luxury for when things slow down, but as a non-negotiable operating requirement. The same way you would not run a precision instrument without maintenance, you cannot run the mind that built your empire without protecting its access to silence. Return to it regularly. Not because you are still alone, but because the person who built everything you have was forged in that silence, and that person must be kept alive and sharp and honest, or everything built will gradually drift from its original integrity towards something softer and more convenient, and ultimately less true. Machiavelli never got back the political position he lost. By the conventional measure of his own ambitions, he failed. He died without the influence he had worked toward his whole life, but he left something that has outlasted every prince he ever advised, every political structure he ever analysed, every government that exiled him or ignored him or briefly employed him and then discarded him. He left the undefeatable thing, the thing that exists independently of circumstance, the work that was built alone in the silence when no one was watching and no one cared, and the only reason to keep going was that the work itself demanded it. That is what you are building. Not just a result, not just a position or a number or a title. You are building the version of yourself that exists on the other side of having done this without help. That version is the actual prize. Everything else, the results, the recognition, the arrival, those are consequences. The person is the achievement, and no one can give you that person. No one can invest in that person or mentor that person into existence or hand that person to you as a reward for networking correctly. That person is only available through the specific process you are already in. The hard one, the quiet one, the one where no one is coming. Keep going.